Hey YouTube, I'm Aaron Ross. Welcome to Getting Started in Photography. On this channel, I've pretty much made it a tagline to just get started. And what I mean by that is regardless of what camera you have, if it's your phone, a film camera, digital camera, whatever it is, that you get out there and you make photos. Because that's the best way that you're going to progress, you're going to learn, you're going to make the photos that are closer to what you're striving for. The more you practice, the closer you're going to get. But one thing I've realized is that I haven't talked a whole lot about what it takes to get started, some of those foundational elements to photography. So starting right now, we're going to jump into some of those basic topics of photography. And we're going to go through a series of videos over the next couple of months where we deep dive into various elements of this. But today we're going to start with the exposure triangle. Now, most cameras are going to have some sort of auto mode where you don't have to worry about the exposure triangle too much, but I wanted to give you this information so that as you progress and you start taking more control over your camera, even if that's your phone, that you understand exactly what you're doing when you change the shutter speed or you adjust the ISO or aperture. And so again, we are going to deep dive into each one of those, but today we're going to focus on how those affect your exposure and how they make a triangle in the terminology that the photography industry uses. The exposure triangle, because it's a triangle, includes three things, surprise, surprise, and that's going to be your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Now you can adjust all three of these to affect the visual look of an image beyond just is it underexposed, correctly exposed, or overexposed, but that's all we're going to talk about today. When we do a deep dive into each one of those, we'll talk about the other ways that changing your shutter speed or aperture or ISO can actually affect the look of your image. So it's about keeping all three of the points of the triangle balanced so that your photo remains correctly exposed. Any one of these being out of balance can cause your photo to be underexposed or overexposed. So we're going to go through each one of those and talk about just the very basics of what they are and how they may affect the exposure of your image. We'll start with shutter speed because it's probably the most straightforward. The shutter speed is how long your shutter is actually open, and therefore how much light is going to be able to hit your sensor or the film that you're using to take the image. So the longer or slower the shutter speed, the more light is going to be let in. So most cameras, modern either DSLR or mirrorless cameras, can be open for 30 seconds or longer, or more commonly are in that 1/125th of a second, maybe 1/25th. They can go all the way up to, a lot of cameras these days, up to 1/4000th of a second or 1/8000th of a second. So the faster the shutter speed, if let's say you're at 1/1000th of a second, you're going to only be letting in a little bit of light. Whereas if you move that to 1/100th of a second, you're letting in 10 times the amount of light that you previously were. And that continues. If you go all the way to a second, you're just letting in so much more light, and you're really going to have to use the other two elements of the exposure triangle to bring down that exposure unless you're in a low light situation, for instance. The second one we'll talk about is aperture. Now this is basically the iris of your eye. When you walk inside and outside and you go from a bright setting to a dark setting or the opposite, your eyes are constantly adjusting to allow the correct amount of light into your eyes. And all of our lenses have aperture blades that we can adjust and open up to allow more light in or less light in. Now the confusing part of this is these are referred to as f-stops, and they're kind of inverse to what you would expect them to be. So the lower the f-stop number, the wider or more open you've allowed your lens to be. So for instance, an f4.0 is going to be relatively open. A lot of our lenses, particularly kit lenses, that may actually be the widest that allows it to go. But some lenses allow you to go even wider to a 1.8 or a 1.4. And although that is a lower number, it's actually a wider aperture, letting in more light. So again, when you have your shutter speed and your aperture, just thinking about those two for a moment, If you have a very fast shutter speed, something like 1/1000th of a second, you're going to need a wider aperture to make sure that the correct amount of light is getting into your camera. And the opposite can also be true. If you have a more closed aperture or a higher f-stop, maybe something like f11, you're going to need a slower shutter speed to allow that correct amount of light in and have a correctly exposed image. Now the last one is ISO, and this one's probably the most confusing element of the exposure triangle. And for a long time, particularly in the film days, you didn't have to worry about this quite as much because it really depended on which film stock you had. It was built into the film as opposed to a setting on your camera that you were having to change with every single photo. For example, I have here Ilford HP5 Plus. This is a black and white film that I'll be getting into and testing and sharing with you guys here in the near future. But this is a ISO 400 film. So ISO is rated as low as 50, even technically I guess you can go down to 1. Most cameras don't go lower than 100, and you can go all the way up to crazy numbers. The manufacturers these days are marketing some crazy insane numbers. In reality, you can go up to things like 3200, 6400, 10,000, things like that. And the higher the number, the more light is going to hit that sensor, or the more sensitive the sensor is going to be. In film, it was set so you knew that 400 was kind of a middle range. There's 100 ISO film stocks that are going to be best outdoors where you have all of that light. And then there's film stocks with 800 and 1600 that were going to be best for indoors because you had less light inside. With today's digital cameras, the higher the ISO, the more brightness or the higher exposure your camera or your image is going to be for that particular photo. It's about balancing all three of these elements. If you have a high ISO, you're going to need an aperture that is more closed and potentially even a faster shutter speed to make sure that because your ISO is so high that you're not overexposing your image. So it's about balancing all three of these, and I'll put up kind of a few charts here on like how they're all going to affect and make sure that if you have one at this level and another here, what the other one's going to need to be, and how as the three of them work together, it's about correctly exposing your image. So again, keep these in mind, and when you're out there making photos with whatever camera you have, that one, you're out there, congratulations, but two, that you're thinking through each one of these elements and playing with them individually to see how they affect the exposure of your image. Now, like I said, we are going to deep dive into each one of those a little bit more thoroughly in upcoming videos, so make sure and subscribe in case you want to learn more about those and how they affect the look of your image, not just the exposure. I hope this was enough to get you out there to continue practicing and progressing in your photography. And if you have any questions about the exposure triangle, leave those below. I'll try and answer as many as I can. And until next time, just get started.